Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unfinished Work, a series about Harrisburg and the Civil War. This episode is called When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and it explores women and children under siege. We are here at the Harrisburg National Civil War Museum with Brett Kelly, curator of the collections. And Brett, I wanted to start immediately with this conversation about the 5 Aprils, the wars fought in the 5 Aprils. Let's look at April 1863. Could you tell us about how the Richmond bread riots actually impact the war?
Sure. Well, the Richmond bread riots started on the day before the riots, the actual riots. Women who were worked in munitions factories around Richmond, and also the wives of the workers at the Tredegar Iron Works got together and had a meeting. They wanted to kind of explore how they might be able to overcome some of the ration shortages. A lot of them were literally starving. They weren't able to feed their families. Inflation was out of control. And they felt that if they got together and met with the governor, maybe he could give them something to build upon.
Now, it didn't go well for them, though, did it?
It didn't. The next day, April 2nd, they met in front of the Washington statue near the State House in Richmond. And as they gathered up, they started to move up towards the State House, and they requested to see the governor. Their request was denied. And so they weren't very happy about that to begin with. They moved back to the park where the Washington statue is, and there are accounts that say that the governor came out and actually did talk to them, but his answers were unsatisfactory to them.
But a pretty bloody hunger riot resulted, is that correct?
Right. They were just kind of, they were so desperate. They were getting worked up with each slight to them, first being denied an audience with the governor, and then getting answers that were just kind of not just the political line. They started to get really upset, and they started to move en masse to the downtown district of Richmond. And as they walked along, they were joined by hundreds of more women, and they started to break into stores. They started to take whatever they could, foodstuffs. They would break in to stores and take clothing and other items that might be useful to them. And it really started getting out of hand.
I want to grab onto that, taking clothing and other items that might be useful for them, because this riot resulted in Jefferson Davis instructing Robert E. Lee to enter Pennsylvania and extract $100 million worth of goods, foods, and items that might be useful to a Confederate army.
Right.
Talk to us about the invasion, and especially about the ransoming of small Pennsylvania towns along 11 and 15.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, by the summer, or I should say the late spring of 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia was getting pretty desperate for food themselves. It was hard for the civilians back home to make ends meet, to feed themselves, but the army out in the field, they were really running out of options. Virginia had been war-torn for a couple of years now. Food was just used up. And so General Lee felt that if he could move his army into Pennsylvania, up into the Cumberland Valley, which was just a breadbasket and
Yes.
untouched by war, if he could get his army up there, he would be able to feed them, gather supplies, basically re-energize his men, possibly take the state capital of Pennsylvania. And along the way, obviously there are a lot of little towns along the way. And as they would come into these towns, they would usually meet with the leading citizens of the town, whether it be the mayor or other prominent citizens, and they would tell them what they needed, what the army needed, whether it was shoes, hats, clothing, money.
And I understand that the fear of losing your wealth, both your bounty and your goods, caused the men to flee with their goods, leaving the women and children behind?
Well, that is definitely a concern when you know that an enemy army is coming towards your town, and you have a herd of fat cows, you're definitely going to want to protect them. And what they would do is they would round up their cows, their steers, their horses, and they would herd them further north in order to save them from the advancing Confederate army.
I understand they were hiding goods in the South Mountain region and also taking things on to Philadelphia. But this left women and children behind. And, what was the climate and the condition or the psyche for the...
Well, it was very tense. There were rumors flying everywhere. One minute they'd say the Southern Army is 1 day's march away, and then the next somebody would ride into town and say they're just a couple of hours away. It was very tense. They didn't know, what was going to happen. The women and children that were left behind were basically entirely defenseless. And, whereas I'm sure they hoped that the Southern soldiers would, respect them as non-combatants, obviously women and children, they're probably hoping their Southern chivalry would come shining through.
Right. And I understand that women also followed the men into battle. Would you tell us about, share with that? This notion of whole families following the troops into the battlefields and camps.
Sure. Well, early on in the war, as new volunteers, who a lot of them had never had any military service, not even in the militia, they would actually have their families come with them and live with them in camp. So it was early on in the war, it was very loosely organized. They were still working out the disciplines. A lot of these citizen soldiers weren't used to taking orders. They were their own people, and
so like floating families and floating villages following the fighting.
Right, exactly. And the wives would do the laundry and the cooking. The kids would, I'm sure, pitch in wherever they could. Now, this was early on when they were pretty much static. They were in camps for an extended period of time, training and getting ready to do the fighting. When the actual campaigning seasons came along, the women and children were generally ordered to, go home.
Now, we find that there are women on the battlefield. Could you tell us about vivandiers and sutlers?
Sure. Vivandiers were basically women who traveled along with the army. They basically were a part of any given regiment. There was one in particular, her name was Mary Tepe. She was a French woman who had moved to the United States, and when the Civil War broke out, she followed her husband into service as the vivandier of the 27th Pennsylvania.
And we find this term daughters of the regiments. Tell us about the daughter of the regiment.
Well, the daughters of the regiment basically were young ladies, often just teenagers. They were generally the daughters of prominent members of the regiment that was forming up. And they would dress in very patriotic costumes, gowns with red, white, and blue streamers and sashes.
Like mascots? Or
Exactly, just like a mascot. They were there to raise the patriotic feeling, to give the men a sort of an extra boost, that type of thing.
And could you share something about the Civil War nurse?
Well, the nurses in the Civil War, they were just absolutely amazing. Women from all walks of life volunteering. Now, early on in the war, when a lot of them would go to volunteer their services, a lot of them were actually turned away, which is amazing considering how many wounded there were. But it was thought that young, pretty women who volunteered to be nurses would be more of a distraction to the soldiers, and it would kind of take away from their getting well.
This is a really fascinating conversation, Brett. Thank you for having us here at the National Civil War Museum. Can I invite you to the studio to join our other guests for the next segment?
Absolutely.
Then we'll be right back.
We're here at the John Harris Simon Cameron Mansion on Front Street in Harrisburg, and I'm here with Mary Scott Beatty, a resident of Harrisburg during the Civil War. And we're going to talk about the events that changed the city of Harrisburg. Now, this is the John Harris Simon Cameron Mansion, and Simon Cameron lived here. He was Lincoln's Secretary of War. And as we know, the war broke out in April of 1861, soon after Lincoln's inauguration. And Simon Cameron started sanitary associations for the help of soldiers. Can you tell me about those and how women in Harrisburg got involved in that?
There were people that were to become part of that sanitary commission, and the folks who handled that were trying to make this as easy as possible for the young soldiers and the very many men that were going to eventually become part of the American troops, or the northern troops, if you would. It was a time when the people in this town were thinking about what they had to do, and the women knew that they would have to take a part in all of this. And what they began to do were many things, including collecting food, because there were going to be soldiers arriving here, leaving here, and as they came to arrive, they would need something to eat. If they were getting ready to leave, of course, they needed a meal before they left. There were so many things that had to be done, including trying to help them get a place even perhaps to stay when there weren't things available in the camps. So we have a lot of things going on right at the very beginning of this time.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me about the soldiers' saloons and soldiers' rests?
There were several people who even with their own money made these things possible for the troops. One of them being E.B. Byers, and his was quite close to where the train station and the camp was, so that was a place that many of them did go. They also had people coming in there who were trying to find their soldier, perhaps a father and a mother, perhaps just a mother or a wife. Each of these people were trying to see if it wasn't possible that they could find a place to stay, and E.B. Byers was one of the people who made this possible, but not the only one at all.
Mm-hmm. And what did the soldiers do there?
Well, when they were at the home or the rest, that was just a place where they could really relax. But they didn't stay there very long because people were coming and going. So if they arrived there, this was usually for their family. They would be finished at the camp, and then they would get together and leave together as a family to go home. Also, families would come and find that, yes, their soldier was here, but he was not alive, and so they would have to take the coffin home with them. So it was happy reunions and very sad moments for many of the families.
The war started in April of 1861, and it ended in April of 1865. And were you and the ladies busy during that entire time working with families and soldiers?
We were indeed. One of the things that we did was to try to collect food so that we had ways to, in many times when the camp was not established at first, to provide food for these soldiers in the very beginning. Of course, it wasn't too long until that was done in-house in the camp itself, and they were not the ones who had to take care of it. But food was always an essential, and as I said, we had not only the soldiers that many times would come to the ladies for this, we also had the families who were in town. So that was a critical thing for us to do. And all of the women who were here in town who were able to do this, who were in good shape to do this, because many times we were carrying things from place to place, they would all become part of this great band of women that helped the soldiers so very much.
It sounds like you became occupied. I mean, as if you had a job and worked full time. Is that the way it was?
That could be very true, because we were all putting every effort we had into doing what we could do for the soldiers who were here, and the soldiers were going off to battle to fight for us and to make this world and our country a better place. There were many, many dollars also spent, and we had raised $5 million and then more after that. So there were a lot of things that we could do with that money and ways to spend that so that we could appropriately do what the soldiers needed to have taken care of for them.
How did this affect your family life?
Well, for me it was not so very, very bad. For many it might have been, but my husband, William, had died just recently, 2 years before the war, and I had a daughter and a son who were grown, so my problem was a little bit easier perhaps than some. And I also had a woman who worked for me to take care of the house, so in that regard I was very well covered. Mm-hmm. So I'm very thankful that that was the case. In the year 1862, I got very, very ill, and for several weeks I wasn't able to do my job as president. And thank goodness for Franny, she took over in a heartbeat. And then she was able to carry on until I was back to regular health and really able to help again.
Now, who was Franny?
Franny is my sister, and she is and was always the person by my side. You see, my sister Frances lived with her husband, Charles Ron, and they were very close to the Jones Hotel. Well, Charles was always on the balcony, but on the day that Abraham Lincoln came to town, he made sure that he stayed there, or he walked up to the Capitol, and he made himself very visible to see the president because that was really important to him. Franny and I, we did watch the president pass by from their little balcony, and it was really quite wonderful to see him. The opportunity for something like that in one's lifetime is rare sometimes. And so that was what made myself and Franny be interested in helping the women. And so we always were very much together. And as I said in an earlier moment here, when I wasn't well and able to take care of things, she stepped in and took care of the things that needed to be done. But I was able to come back and to finish that job. And I found that what we did for the gentlemen was probably one of the most exciting and helpful things that I could have done in my life.
You know, I've read some of Charles Ron's diaries. I didn't realize that it was your sister who was married to him.
Indeed. But he courted me first. I can always tell everyone that. And we had a very pleasant time together. However, I was married to Mr. William Beatty, and he was a wonderful husband.
I've been talking with Mary Scott Beatty at the John Harris Simon Cameron Mansion on Front Street in Harrisburg. The house was built in 1766 by John Harris and was later purchased by Simon Cameron, Lincoln's Secretary of War. And I hope that you'll take some time to enjoy a slice of Harrisburg history by coming by for a visit and for tours.
And welcome back. We are having an incredible conversation with two outstanding historians, educators, and living history interpreters, Larry and Annette Keener Farley, who are now retired. They served as volunteer historians at Gettysburg National Military Park. We were talking about women in service to America and in service to the Union during the 5 Aprils, April 1861 to 65. Could you tell us about these women's leagues, guilds, and societies that sprung up?
Well, most of those societies that you mentioned are volunteer organizations. And like many communities prior to the Civil War, Harrisburg had a number of volunteer organizations already in place. One, for example, was it was called the Benevolent Society of Harrisburg, that they were made volunteered by women, and they raised money to take care of the impoverished of Harrisburg. So it was a natural fit when, in April 1861, there's a call for volunteerism to help soldiers.
And I understand, Larry, that these women are also raising money for uniforms, for ammunition, and for other equipment for the
Yes,
soldiers?
they did this on the local level to begin with. As Annette said, there were these local organizations in almost every town. And eventually this will grow into larger organizations. The largest would be the United States Sanitary Commission, which was modeled after an organization in Britain that aided the British Army during the Crimean War.
And before we go to that, could you tell me about the Ladies Auxiliaries of Harrisburg?
Well, Annette is our expert on that.
Well, in August of 1862, there are some published reports and in the newspapers requesting ladies of Harrisburg to come together and meet and form one consolidated effort. Prior to September of 1862, you have a number of church organizations and lay organizations that are doing the same thing. And the effort is to combine all of these organizations and become one larger group, and thus became the Ladies Union Relief Association of Harrisburg.
The Ladies Union Relief Association of Harrisburg.
That is correct. They were formed in 1862, and what they did is made most of their efforts to supporting the soldiers who were stationed at Camp Curtin They provided meals, they visited the soldiers. Anything that was needed for them, they did, including knitting socks, making sure they had blankets. As time goes on, they expand their efforts. In summer of 1863 and into the fall, where supplies in Gettysburg are almost nothing, the Ladies Union Relief Association makes a special appeal to the people in central Pennsylvania, please help get food, clothing, blankets for the 1,300 or so wounded soldiers who are still in Gettysburg.
My goodness. Now, Larry, could you go back to the Sanitation Commission and talk about when Simon Cameron first started?
Well, Simon Cameron was actually opposed to it when ladies brought this idea to him of creating this commission that would aid the United States Army's medical department. And the view of both Simon Cameron from here in Harrisburg, who was our Secretary of War as the war begins, and Abraham Lincoln is that they were a fifth wheel on a coach, somewhat unnecessary. But the scope of the war required more than the Army was used to dealing with. Just to give you an example, before the war starts, the U.S. Army is 15,000 men. A year later, there's over 500,000 men. They aren't used to dealing with numbers like this, especially in the medical corps. And so they need all sorts of supplies that, to aid both wounded and sick men. And these civilian organizations are going to raise the money, get donations, and supply the U.S. Medical Department with what they need to actually keep the men in good shape.
Now, we were talking about a profound number of donations. I had thought the number was $5 million in cash that they raised and $15 million in goods. You just enlightened me and advanced that number.
It appears the figure may be closer to 25 million. These women were very persuasive when they would go out and ask for donations, and both money and supplies to various citizens. Also, in 1864, they start to run sanitary fairs, huge events in big cities that will go on for 2 weeks. Here in Pennsylvania, we had our biggest one in Philadelphia, Logan Square in the center of town. They actually put up a temporary building there that covered a city block, and there were all sorts of exhibitions that you could go and see, and things that you could buy. And of course, you paid an admission to go in there. So these women were very creative when it came to raising money.
And $25 million in this time period, if we had a banker, he would immediately, or she would immediately do the mathematics of the equation. But at any time, this is a remarkable amount of money for a volunteer organization, correct?
It's a phenomenal amount of money.
Well, when you consider the soldiers are earning, what, $13 a month, $25 million is a lot of money.
It's a lot of money to extract during a time of war, a time of embargo, a crises in industries colliding. Could you tell me also, I believe that the women's leagues and the Sanitary Fairing Commission did medical work and research for medicine and new ways?
Yes, they did. One of the things about the Army is that it was a very entrenched bureaucracy in all of its staff departments, and in particular in the medical corps. And the Sanitary Commission, one of the first things they did is to study medicine. And they came up with various recommendations that improved not only the treatment of the soldiers, but the sanitation conditions in the camps. And they relied on a lot of the work that had been done by this previous British organization in the Crimean War. They also sent inspectors out into the field to make sure that the medical department and the sanitation of the camps was up to par. And if they weren't, they reported back and very often brought political pressure through their local congressmen and senators to get things improved. So they were watchdogs of the Army's medical department, and that helped to improve the conditions.
And tell us about the soldiers' saloons and the soldiers' rest that the women ran for the recreation and of the soldiers doing.
Well, the first thing I would say is when you hear the word saloon, you tend to think alcohol. They did not serve alcohol at them. Think more of a restaurant.
I wanted to get that out.
That they set these up in most towns. There was the Cooper Union Refreshment Saloon in Philadelphia. Here in Harrisburg, we had the soldiers' retreats, and most little towns would have these if troops passed through on the railroad, so that men could come in, get a meal, get cleaned up, take a nap if possible, if they had the time. And so anything that they needed, they would have writing supplies there so that the men could send letters home. Whatever they could do for the men, they would supply. And this occurred, as I said, in almost every town that was along a railroad, the troops were moved. So here in Harrisburg, with over 300,000 men passing through this little town of about 18,000 people, we had an awful lot of troops here, and so we had a lot of them to service.
I want to go back to that notion of a town that was about 13 to 18,000 people swelling to 300,000 because of the camp. What was the impact on the families of providing goods and services to the soldiers at a time of plenty? Was there a conflict between how do I feed my family or how do I feed the army?
Well, from a family standpoint, I'm really not sure. The women who were able to donate goods and services to the soldiers did so in addition to what either they were able to eat less at home.
So they're really making ends meet here.
They're going to make ends meet. They want to take care of the soldiers. They want to do their bit, even if it's, say, one pot of vegetable soup as opposed to 2 pots.
And before we go to our next guest, help us with this doing their bit. It somehow has been trivialized about these women making socks and haversacks and bandages, but these were very important things. Would you help us lift up this notion of the real impact of these goods to soldiers in the field?
Especially when it comes to socks, they wear out very quickly, and the socks would wear out before the shoes would wear out. Men would wear them almost constantly, so you need to have socks to help you. I mean, it's a cleanliness, comfort, and sometimes a necessary part of life.
And the 4 to 5 items that women were producing in mass, as you said, Larry, we went from 15,000 soldiers in the front of the war to how many by?
500,000 a year later.
To 500,000.
And in the South, they had 250,000 men in the Army then. So you've got 750,000 men that now have to be supplied. And they need everything.
They need everything. That's where we're going to go to our next guest, but right after this interesting fact.
We're at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, and I'm talking with Mary Tebbe. What is a vivandière?
Well, a vivandière actually comes from the French military. It became famous after the Crimean War in the 1800s, and Americans loved the French Zouave troops. So, in 1861, when the Civil War started, people wanted as many authentic things as they could, and they loved the French army at this time. So when the 114th started, they wanted to be as authentic as possible, so they had a vivandière, which is a sutler. It was a woman who followed the army into the field of battle, and she sold food and supplies, but she was also a nurse, a seamstress, a laundress, and in my case, I was also a soldier.
A soldier?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, when you're on the field, most people aren't really concerned with who they're shooting at as long as it's the enemy. So while you're in the front lines and you're dragging wounded men off, you're giving people water and whiskey, you start to realize that you're also being shot at. And since I did carry a gun myself, a .44 caliber pistol, I decided I might as well use it. So I did.
So you shot at soldiers as well?
I did. In fact, in the Battle of Gettysburg, which was one of 13 battles that I am actually registered that I fought in, I was registered to fight there. I was legitimately a soldier for Gettysburg, and people knew it.
Did the men in the 114th respect you?
Perhaps not at first. Many times when you hear vivandière, they're called camp followers, and it's not necessarily a term that's well respected. Mm-hmm. But after actually fighting on the front lines and taking care of these men and living with them for months and years on end, you can't help but find a communal respect for each other. And goodness, after taking 9 shots myself, I have been shot at 9 times and wounded. It's very easy that they considered me one of them.
Were you seriously wounded?
Indeed, actually, there's a bullet in my left ankle which has yet to be removed and is very painful, very, very painful.
That's amazing. Tell me about your uniform.
Well, as you can see, it's a very bright uniform, very colorful, very red. And this was the purpose of a Zouave uniform. It was meant to attract and basically say, I'm not scared of you. And so with this uniform, it reflects the 114th. But for a vivandier, I would have this short skirt and I would have pants underneath it to help me move better in the field and also to reflect what unit I was with. So my uniform is actually government made.
How did you aid the soldiers on the field?
Anything that could be done, and I could do it, I did. So yes, I would load guns, I would bring ammunition to the field, I would make sure that the men had water or whiskey or wine, whichever. I did have a whiskey keg with me, so I was always making sure that they were all right. I was checking on wounded soldiers, so sometimes you'd see me carrying them to a field hospital or taking care of them on the field, as it were, if they were fatally wounded. But yes, anything that needed to be done during wartime, that's what I did, because as many men and as people as were needed as possible, who was there, that's who was there.
I see that you have a medal on your uniform. Can you tell me about that?
I am only one of 2 women to actually receive the Kearney Cross, and I received this after Fredericksburg and Chambersville. And this is what happened after I was wounded. I was hit in my left ankle when I was in the front lines, and I got this medal for brave and meritorious conduct. But I never wore it, only in photographs or if I was going out somewhere, because I felt that it took away from the bravery of other men who had also, I felt, had earned the right to have this, but were not given the medal themselves.
As hard as you worked and as much of value you brought to the soldiers, I'm surprised that you felt like you didn't maybe deserve it as much as the men did. What was life like for you after the war?
I would like to say that it was lovely. But sadly, coming back, the excitement of having a new life, of living something normal, was tainted by the fact that I was not recognized for my service. Years of service, of sacrifice, of dealing with men who I respected and who respected me, but I was no longer considered a war hero or anything. I was basically struck from the records. No one knew I had done anything, and I became very sad. My life was not a good one after the war. It was disheartening.
What kind of work did you do?
After the war, I opened a candy shop in Pittsburgh, perhaps one of the things that made me happier. The children were very sweet, and if anything else, they loved to listen to my stories, and I tried to tell them what life was like for a woman during the Civil War.
Thank you for your service. The women of the United States really appreciate what you did.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for being with us. We are at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, and you can come if you want to learn more about the Civil War and the role of women and children in the war. Come to the National Civil War Museum and explore.
And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed our cameo. While you were watching the cameo, we were having a fabulous conversation here in the studio. Larry, you were responding to a point that Brad made about the April riots. Would you share with us?
Well, just a few weeks before the April bread riots in Richmond, there had been an explosion at the ammunition factory there in Richmond. And killed in that explosion were 42 women and girls. And so this is one of the things that women were doing back then, is moving into industry, into very dangerous jobs. And I had to wonder, what would the reaction of those bread rioters have been to all of the women who died? Was that one of the things that was an impetus to the riot itself? Is that not only were they short of food, but women were dying in the Civil War.
Women were dying in the Civil War. Now, as you can see, we've been joined by our friend and colleague, Jim Schmeck, who is a historian, scholar, interpreter, tour guide, founding and current president of the Camp Curtin Historical Society, and the proprietor of Civil War and More Shop in Mechanicsburg, where all of you should wind up if you have questions about the end of any of these things that we've brought up. Jim, welcome to our little gang here. We've been talking about women. Still, would like to look at the conversation about children, and you and I were sharing some interesting facts about young boys on the battlefield in general, and drummer boys in particular. Would you?
Right. There was drummer boys, but the majority of them actually were men. It's a little misconception that's out there, but the drummer boys that were there, most of them they had rules like under 18 years old. There's an interesting story at Gettysburg, the 150th Pennsylvania. Their drummer boy, he was also, they used him as stretcher bearers also, not just drummer boys. And he went to help a man who lost his arm by an artillery shell. And when he came back to get the stretcher, it was blown up by an artillery shell. And if he wouldn't have went to get that man, he would have lost his life. A lot of them did lose their lives, and you don't hear about that.
Those boys were as young, anyone, Larry? How young were those drummer boys?
I think I've seen reports down to 8.
Down to 8 years old. And they're next to the flag bearers, are they?
Usually they're behind them. That's where the field music stood, so that they would be near the colonel of the regiment, who was also behind the flag, so that he could give orders to the music, which is part of the way in which you controlled troops back then.
So they're very much in the front.
Very much.
In the front line. Now we find other young boys on the battlefield. Jim, I was interested about the fact that officers sometimes, and in fact our own president, sometimes President Lincoln took his son onto the battlefield. Will you share that story?
He lost Willie in '62, but he had Tad, who was really Thomas, with him in 1864 down in 5 around the Petersburg area. He was misbehaving a lot, and so they finally gave him a sandwich, and he said, "That's why I was bad. I was hungry." So, but Lincoln also had his children here in Harrisburg when he visited on his way to be sworn in as president.
And I understand that Ulysses S. Grant took his son onto the battlefield also. Our program, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, really is looking at these women and children, and now can we turn, Jim, to the widows? And you had shared with me some very important information about widows and pensions.
Yes, well, if your husband passed away, you had to prove that he did pass away. You had to prove you were married. You had to prove he was in the service, okay? And you had to prove that your children really were yours. And there was a case where a lady had 5 children. She found 4 of the birth certificates, could not find the 5th. Okay, they said, well, you're a good Catholic woman. You probably have baptism records. Let's go check them out. Well, the family's name was Cooley, C-O-O-L-E-Y. The baptism certificate had C-O-W-L-E-Y, and the government wouldn't grant her money for that 5th child. See, a lot of times when they were having a child, they didn't have birth certificates like we have today in small towns. You'd have a witness sitting in the room, and they would say, you know, I'm sound body and mind, and I state that so-and-so had a child this date, and he named the child this name, and they put that piece of paper in a Bible, and that's all you had for a birth certificate. So a lot of times if things were misspelled, they did not honor it at all. Now you had teenagers marrying soldiers in their 70s and 80s. You know, my dad in the 1960s had a Confederate widow on his mail route, and she was from New Orleans. And he mentioned, just jokingly, did you ever hear of Benjamin Butler? Of course, you don't mention his name down there because he accused the women of being prostitutes, so they didn't quit dumping their bedpans down there on top of
called the Butler Salute.
Yes, you told me the Butler Salute. And she said, sir, don't you ever mention that man's name on my property again. Now get off my property. So it's a neat story.
Jim, we started by talking about these Richmond bread riots and the hungry women and children. In a wonderful document that you and Larry authored, you tell the story about Governor Curtin finding the orphans at his back door begging for bread. Would you share that?
Right. Well, originally there was $50,000. I just want to back up just a little bit to help the story along. He was offered $50,000 by the Pennsylvania Railroad to help the Northern War effort. And legislation never got through. It was never taken. Then Curtin said, let's take it for wounded soldiers to help them, the disabled men. That never went through. But finally, on our first official Thanksgiving Day, which was November 26th, back then the law was the last Thursday of the month, 2 children knocked on Curtin's door at 2nd and Chestnut Street. That's why I have Executive House Apartments there today. And they said, we're hungry. He says, well, where's your parents? Well, our dad was killed in the war, and our mom died, and we have no food. So out of that, that's where he comes up with the idea. He then approaches the Pennsylvania Railroad again and said, let's give the $50,000 to start up the orphanage system.
And you told me about a gentleman who was the superintendent of the orphans?
Right, there was Mr. Burroughs was the first couple years, but then at the end of the war, the big push was a lot of them started getting built in 1866. So it was Colonel McFarland from the 151st Pennsylvania who lost his leg on day 1 there at Gettysburg.
And we know that in your Camp Curtin Church there is a monument from the 16ers. Would you share that story with us?
There's once you were 16, you went out into society, and actually they brought a medal today of a 16ers that they received in 1916 to a convention they had here.
And the 16ers were an orphanage group?
Yes, they were. Once you were 16, you were then graduated from orphan school, and you went out into society.
So that's why they were called the 16ers. We have a lot of really wonderful items on the table, and we will come back shortly after this break and begin to look at some of the Chautauqua items on the table. And as we do, maybe we'll have a conversation about women in the workplace during those 5 Aprils. So please stay with us. We've been having a great conversation about women in the workplace during those 5 Aprils and women taking up the jobs of men as they go off to war, not only in the home and in the field, but also in the factory. And Larry, you were sharing the psychological conversation about what happens when the men go off to war and what happens when they come back.
Well, oddly, at the end of the Civil War, women essentially return to the home, into their traditional roles. They don't, for the most part, stay in the factories, especially the more industrial type things. They do stay in the cotton mills and the silk mills and things like that, which they had traditionally done before the war. But in terms of going into manufacturing uniforms, ammunition, that sort of thing, they do go back into the home, unlike at the end of World War II when women stayed in the factories and even grew into the workforce.
Now, speaking about women in the ammunition factories, you shared with us a tragedy in Allegheny County.
Well, in Allegheny County, the U.S. Arsenal there had the largest loss of female life in one place in one day with an explosion there. It occurred on September the 17th, 1862, the same day as the Battle of Antietam, which is considered the bloodiest day in American history with 23,000 casualties in one day. Well, on that same day, an accident occurred there at the Allegheny Arsenal that ended up killing 70 women and girls, some as young as 12, and 8 men and boys. And that was the largest loss of civilian life in one place during the Civil War. So it gives you an idea of how dangerous the work could be. And this was just the largest one. There were explosions all the time in Philadelphia and Washington, throughout the South. They didn't have the same safety procedures that we have today, nor did they have any anti-child labor laws. So lots of women and children were dying in these factories.
Yeah. Closer to home here, we discovered not the loss of lives, but the loss of jobs, particularly of Irish women and children in the Harrisburg Cotton Factory. Would you share with us?
Well, as I know, in 1861, there's quite a few women and young girls who are working in the cotton mills, and they're very patriotic. as I think I mentioned before, they even go on their own. They are making haversacks for the soldiers. But in time, because of a lack of cotton, the cotton mill is going to close.
And that cotton mill is on North Street, by the way, where our current YMCA is today.
In another year or so, the cotton factory becomes a hospital. It's needed for additional wounded and sick soldiers that the Camp Curtin Hospital cannot take in. In 1862, it's opened, it's later closed, and then in late June of 1863, it's reopened, and it stays open into September and possibly into November of 1863 because of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Now, here's a question that I didn't ask you before, but it just came to mind. We know that there was an incredible number of prisoners after the Battle of Gettysburg that were brought here to Harrisburg and imprisoned, and the women also had to cook and feed and provide for them. What was that prison?
The prison was in Camp Curtin. Now, back then, for the people that don't know, Camp Curtin was the area of the Dauphin County Agricultural Fairgrounds.
Right.
The forerunner of the farm show. If it's still there today, it would be Schuylkill to Maclay, 5th to 7th. So the northeast corner, which would be around the 7th and Schuylkill area in Harrisburg, was a Confederate prisoner of war camp. And then they were transferred to Elmira, New York, or out in Fort Delaware. There was the two places after Gettysburg. There was roughly about 2,000 dropped off wounded after the Battle of Gettysburg. So all your schools and churches were taken over, by the wounded and sick. Not just 2,000 Confederates. Total men was 2,000. 15 Confederates died from the Battle of Gettysburg while they were on the mend here in Harrisburg, and they're in the Harrisburg Cemetery. T. Morris Chester's mother, Jane, worked with Confederate prisoners in Camp Curtin.
Tremendous stories. You mentioned that Abraham Lincoln had his son Tad on the battlefield with him. Brett, you brought a carte de visite about that. Would you tell us about some of the things you have on the table?
Well, yes, I brought some photographs, carte de visite photographs, and one of them is of President Lincoln and his son Tad. President Lincoln had already lost his son Willie in 1862, and the impact of losing his son. He had already lost a son a decade earlier, so President Lincoln was not, this wasn't unknown to him, losing children, but it was still very painful. But he kept Tad very close to him after that, after Willie passed away. And this photograph is really an iconic photo of President Lincoln and his son and the relationship they had.
And you have a tremendous carte de visite collection at the National Civil War Museum. I know you also have a letters collection, and would you share with us some of the letters?
Yes, I brought a letter here. It's actually a letter that was written the day after the Richmond bread riots. It's written by a Southern mother to her son. And in it, she talks about the health of the family. They were a fairly affluent family. The father was a lawyer. He ran a law practice. And so they were fairly well off. But the whole letter is really about how she isn't really feeling very well. The father has a persistent cough, and he's really not doing all that well. And then she talks about how the streets were being run by the mob the day before, and how they had broken into shops. And the morning of when the letter was written, the husband of what she calls the ringleader of the mob came to visit their father to ask if he would represent his wife during her trial.
How do we access the letters and the diaries at the National Civil War Museum?
Well, we are still in the process of cataloging. We have upwards of 23,000 original
23,000
letters, diaries, documents. And what we would hope to do in the next couple of years is have it open to researchers to come and be able to search through our database and pull up the letters and photographs, all with high resolution images, so that we don't have to touch the originals as often. We hope that the museum becomes a destination for researchers.
And for genealogists who are looking for their families. Larry, you've taught me in these 10 plus years that I've had the pleasure of knowing you about the joy and the art of storytelling with artifacts. Could you tell us about some of the artifacts that you brought on?
The one that I'll show you is a very special medal that was actually struck for the 1864 Philadelphia Sanitary Fair. It was designed by a fellow by the name of Anthony Paquet, who was an engraver at the U.S. Mint. He's also the fellow who engraved and designed the first Medal of Honor for the Army and the Navy. And this was a medal that was given to the biggest fundraisers at the 1864 Philadelphia Sanitary Fair. And what it shows on it is a goddess of liberty handing a cup of medicine to an Army surgeon who is treating a wounded soldier. And around the outside it says, "We give our wealth for those who give their health for us." And that's part of that thing that we were talking about earlier, these women going out and getting people to give their wealth to aid wounded soldiers. But this will give you an idea of the impact and the influence of the U.S. Sanitary Commission and these women, that they were able to get this engraver at the U.S. Mint to not only design this medal, but the U.S. Mint struck it. So there you have the official U.S. Mint striking a medal for a private organization. And so this is an award that was given at the Sanitary Fair.
Where and how can we hear more stories from you in that?
They can contact us through our website, which is civilwardance.org. In addition to the military and civilian aspects of the Civil War, we do Civil War era dancing. We're usually out several times a month running balls or doing dance demonstrations.
Excellent. And Jim, you have so many incredible artifacts to tell. Would you share two with us? The orphanage and also this wonderful medal.
The Civil War orphanage for the area was in Whitehall. Now, Whitehall today is called Camp Hill. After the Civil War, Postmaster Bowman renames Whitehall Camp Hill after John Weinbrenner's church camp up on the hill, the founder of the Church of God. And it was located on the 2100 block of Market Street in Camp Hill. It was opened in 1866 and shut down in 1891. Now, the orphanage system started shrinking in the late 1870s, so they built the Scotland School down towards Chambersburg and combined all the orphanages in 1895, and that was recently shut down in 2009.
And the medal?
The medal is, I got it on eBay, and the gentleman said, "I don't know what this is, just says 16ers Harrisburg." I got it for like $5. Nobody bid on it. It's great, and it's mint condition, and of course they had a convention here in 1916, and it was the same year that the Camp Curtin Memorial Church was built at 6th and Woodbine Street, and the funds for that was raised by James Beaver, Governor Beaver, General Beaver, Beaver Stadium, Penn State. And it was a painting of Christ coming down, healing a dying Union soldier, done by C. Day Rudy, who was a 16er.
And these are the veterans of, orphans of the veterans
of the North
of the Civil War.
That's right.
We have so many things to talk about. How can our viewers and our guests connect with you?
Well, I have my bookstore. I'm there Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. I have other employees the other days, but check out civilwarandmore.com. You can check out our address where we're at in downtown Mechanicsburg in the square. And also, campcurtin.org is the Historical Society's website. And we have quarterly meetings, and everything will be posted on that website too if they want to ask questions.
And a wonderful pamphlet that the two gentlemen have done. I've had the pleasure of dancing in the dance squares with the Keener Farleys. I am always in the collection at the National Civil War Museum. Thank you so much for being with us for the hour.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory,